Hello everyone, we are in for this week's video for the month of October. So this is our third video of the month. And as I mentioned last week, as we usually do a video for around the Halloween holiday, something of a creepy topic or something of that manner, since we always do that around Halloween, I wanted to go ahead and make sure that that comes out next week in tune with the holiday since it is next Thursday. So for this week, we're going to go ahead and do the next president video for October, the one that we would do this month. And for this month, last month we covered Teddy Roosevelt. So for this month, we are going to cover the 27th President of the United States, William Howard Taft. And Mr. President Taft, we have seen his face before. This would be President Taft. President Taft has kind of a notoriety thing because of the fact that there is an ongoing myth about he got stuck in a bathtub. While it is true he had an oversized bathtub, as to whether or not he got stuck in it, there does not seem to be water to hold up to that myth. So it is probably not true, but it's something that Taft has gained fame from. So as always with these, we just go through a short biography. Although with Taft's here, there was actually quite a bit that I felt would be more willing to put here because Taft is kind of overlooked, I think, in terms of presidents. He's often believed to have been a bad president. I don't think he was an absolute bad president. It's just that he had what I think gets Taft the bit of stain on his legacy is the factor that he came in on the promise that I'm going to uphold everything that Roosevelt did, only to pretty much turn 180 and not really do everything that he had promised to do, and him and Roosevelt ended up having a political split over the issue, and I think that has stained his legacy some part just because of how well Roosevelt is received. But Taft was no slouch in opinion either, I don't think. He's very much in, I want to say, the upper half of American presidents. He's not in the bottom tier. So William Howard Taft was born on September 15th of 1857 in Cincinnati, Ohio. He is the second to last so far of the Buckeye presidents. We'll only have one more president after this that has come from Ohio. Never know when one might come from in the future, but as of right now, the last president that we had come from Ohio was Warren G. Harding over 100 years ago, back in 1921. And Taft is second to last of the Ohioans so far to have become president. Now, Taft came from a very prominent family. His father was Alphonso Taft, and Alphonso had been a prominent Republican attorney in Cincinnati who had also served as Secretary of War and Attorney General under President Grant during his administration from 1869 till 1877. And Alphonso later was appointed by President Chester Arthur, who took office upon the assassination of Garfield. He later would take office as ambassador to Austria-Hungary and Russia under President Arthur's administration. So Taft's father was a very well-known public figure, a very well-known Republican politician, both in Cincinnati and abroad. And Taft did not, by any means, grow up in a poor household. He grew up in a very privileged family at that point. Taft attended Yale University in his youth. He would graduate second in his class, and it would also kind of start a family tradition. His father had also attended Yale, and I believe most of the Taft family, and the Taft family is still a major political dynasty in Ohio politics in particular. The Taft family is still around. They are still a dominant political dynasty in many things. I think it was only about 20 years ago, our Ohio governor here was Bob Taft, who I believe was the grandson or great-grandson of President Taft. So there's still an active political family, but I believe it's a tradition for them to attend Yale at some point because of the factor that Taft's dad did, Taft himself did, I believe his sons did as well. And Taft would graduate second in his class at Yale University. He would then proceed to study law at the University of Cincinnati and would be admitted to the Ohio bar in 1880. In October of 1880, but before that, shortly after graduating from the Ohio bar and getting admitted to that, he ended up starting a private practice, but this was very shortly put on hold for Taft, who in October of that year was appointed to be assistant prosecutor for Hamilton County, which is the county of which the city of Cincinnati is in. Now, Taft would hold that position for roughly 2 years before resigning in January of 1882 after President Arthur would appoint him Collector of Internal Revenue for Ohio's 1st District. And no doubt this also probably came on the heels of the factor that of course, his father, under President Arthur, was the acting ambassador to Russia and Austria-Hungary, and I'm sure that his dad had kind of a word in and had a hand in getting President Arthur to appoint his son as, in a more prestigious position than just a county prosecutor. So he would end up being appointed the collector of internal revenue for Ohio's first district. So basically, tax collector, if you want to say it like that. Tax collector for the first district of Ohio. Now, Taft would one day dream of being appointed to the Supreme Court, and that is something that I think gets overlooked with Taft. Taft is kind of criticized at times for the way he conducted his presidency, but we have to be respectful here. Taft did not ever really want to seek the presidency. It was kind of almost forced on him, and we'll get to why that was later on. But Taft, in his own mind, never truly sought the presidency, I don't think. His main goal in life, he loved the justice system, and his top goal was he wanted to be appointed as a judge on the Supreme Court. Not necessarily the Chief Justice or anything, but he wanted to be one of those judges on the top court in the country. And that was Taft's dream. And during his time as the tax collector for Ohio's first district, he ended up standing up for ethics in his posts, and this was something that he would very much continue throughout all the posts that he had. And this is most noticeable because during his time as the internal revenue collector for Ohio's first district, he refused to dismiss employees who fell out of political favor with the rest of the Republican Party or who had been a member of the opposing Democratic Party. And if they were good workers, if they were solid good workers and dependable and just had a different political difference, Taft was not going to be the one that fired them over that. Even though he might be being urged to by higher-ups within the party, Taft would not do it, saying this is a good person, they work well, I'm not just going to get rid of them because they don't politically agree with you. He would end up resigning the post in March of 1883 and then wrote to President Arthur expressing his wish to begin a private practice in Cincinnati and retire from the public service, thus hoping that President Arthur, of course, would not call on him again to serve in any other positions for the time being. By 1884, Taft was meeting regularly with Helen, or Nellie, as her nickname was, Helen Herron. She was the daughter of a local lawyer in Cincinnati, and her dad was also a Republican Party activist. She agreed to marry him in 1886 after they courted for a number of years. They ended up having 3 children together. Helen would be just as influential on Taft as his parents had been about him pursuing a political career. His parents had always kind of urged Taft, follow in your father's footsteps. Your father's accomplished a name for himself. You can as well. You can continue the legacy of the family. And Helen, upon marrying Taft, she very much has her own kind of political ambitions for herself and her husband, and she is very much that pusher to William, or Bill, I believe he was also called, and she very much was pushing Bill to kind of, you should run for this office, you should hold this position, you should even seek this one in the future. She was kind of that guiding voice in his ear. In 1887, a year after getting married, Taft would accept an appointment to fill the term of a judge on the Ohio Superior Court. He was then elected to that position on his own right in 1888 by popular vote, the only other time other than the 1908 election when he was elected president that Taft ever won an office by a popular vote. And of course, Taft sought this because it would further his judicial career with advancement further up, allowing him to possibly be a candidate to be named to the Supreme Court. In 1890, Taft was appointed U.S. Solicitor General, which was the 3rd highest position in the Justice Department. Out of the cases that he prosecuted and argued on behalf of the United States government before the Supreme Court, Taft would actually win 15 of the 18 cases that he argued, which was quite impressive for the time. He would end up being appointed in 1892 to the newly created U.S. Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals with jurisdiction over Ohio, Michigan, Tennessee, and Kentucky, and this was a lifetime appointment with the possibility of appointment to the Supreme Court as a possible consequence of this. So this was a position that if Taft so chose, he could hold for until his dying day. He would not be removed unless he chose to resign or chose to retire. And this was also a position of which was a prime candidate for someone to be picked in the case of a vacancy on the Supreme Court, and the president was looking to nominate a justice. These were a prime position, someone on the U.S. District Circuit Courts. And Taft now has the prime position to be able to possibly get nominated to his dream. all the way back in 1892. So before we continue here we have a picture. This is a picture of Taft during his Yale years, just to give you an idea of what he looked like when he was younger. This was him during his time at Yale University in his youth. And then here we have a picture. This is during the time of the White House, years later, but I mean, we already discussed it a little bit. This is Taft and his wife, Helen. This was his wife. He affectionately would often call her Nellie, but Helen was his wife. And Helen, a lasting legacy of her time in D.C. with President Taft, was she was the one that kind of had a lot of cherry blossom trees planted on the grounds of the National Mall. That was Helen's doing. She loved the trees, and she had a large number of them planted during her time as First Lady. And many of those trees, or descendants of those trees, are still living today in the national capital. Now, in early 1900, President Taft was summoned by not President Taft, but Taft would end up being summoned by President McKinley to the White House. And Taft was not initially told why President McKinley had summoned him. At first, Taft hoped it meant that there was going to be a vacancy on the Supreme Court and that McKinley was possibly thinking about nominating him to take the seat. So that's what Taft's hope was. But it was not that at all. Instead, what McKinley told Taft was that he wanted to place Taft on a commission to organize a civilian government in the newly acquired U.S. territory of the Philippine Islands, which we had just won in 1898 from the Spanish during the Spanish-American War. McKinley wanted to put Taft on the head of this commission in order to set up a civilian government. However, if Taft accepted to be on this commission, it would require Taft's resignation from his U.S. Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals judge job. So Taft would have to resign this position that would put him in a prime candidacy for a Supreme Court pick in order to be on this commission. However, but McKinley assured Taft that although he would have to resign the position in order to be on the commission, he did assure Taft that he would nominate Taft for the next vacancy on the Supreme Court as soon as one come up. That no matter what, if you resign this, I will make sure that when the next vacancy on the court comes up, that you are the first person I shall nominate to fill that position. Taft would accept this deal on one condition, that he was head of the commission appointed, and McKinley agreed. So Taft and his commission would end up taking executive power in the Philippines on September 1st of 1900. Taft would be appointed civilian governor on July 4th of the following year, in 1901, and he would work to integrate the Philippines into the larger American economy and into the larger American sphere, which now it's a U.S. territory. He argues it needs to be part of the American culture. Now, Taft would oversee the end of the Philippine-American War, which was a carryover from the Spanish-American War, where the Filipino rebels that had previously been fighting the Spanish in the Philippines were now fighting the Americans, because at the end of the war, the Filipinos had been fighting for their independence just as much as the Cubans had been in Cuba. However, since the United States had kind of disregarded the Filipino wishes and took control of the territory, they now shifted their anger toward the newly arrived American troops. And there was this guerrilla war going on in the Philippine Islands until about 1902, when that officially came to an end during Taft's time as civilian governor of the territory. And during that time, he had approved of the use of concentration camps in rebel provinces where there were still guerrilla rebels active. However, Taft also saw that he wanted to do this. That meant he did not share the racial mentality that a lot of Americans held at the time, and he was much more willing to integrate the Filipinos into the larger American culture. As, for instance, he did not impose racial segregation at any public events that happened during the Philippines, and he also allowed the Filipinos some hand in the local government matters in order to have some sort of self-rule and involvement in their own government. Taft would see the Filipino people as needing, quote, self-guidance, is what he called it, before they could be given self-rule, and predicted that it would take decades before that happened. Now, how actually wise that was to say that the Filipino people needed self-guidance, I don't think that's quite anywhere near true. I think they definitely would have been incapable of maintaining and forming their own country and ruling it on their own. I don't think they needed the United States to come in there and do that for them. But that was Taft's logic. Taft's logic was, you guys just need some self-guidance, And a few decades down the road, we can probably entertain the idea of self-rule, of statehood, or independence if you seek that route, which would end up becoming quite true because the Philippines would not gain independence from the United States until 1946. Now, McKinley's assassination in September of 1901 would lead to Taft's friend and Vice President, Teddy Roosevelt, becoming president. Roosevelt twice would offer Taft a Supreme Court appointment in 1902 when one came up, but Taft refused as he did not think that his work in the Philippines was quite done, and he didn't want to leave until he knew that his job there had been done. He had fulfilled the tasks that had been assigned to him. Although he wanted that Supreme Court pick, he put his wishes on hold and his dream on hold simply to fill out the duty that he felt he was obligated to finish. In 1904, Taft would accept Roosevelt's offer to become Secretary of War, the post that his father had previously held in the Grant administration, as long as he retained supervision of Filipino affairs in the Philippines. He would also travel during this time as Secretary of War for Roosevelt. He would travel extensively and oversaw construction of the Panama Canal in Panama. Roosevelt would end up when around the 1908 comes around, we know there's a presidential election coming up. Roosevelt has declared previously he would not seek another term, even though he secretly kind of wants to. So he's urged to pick a successor, somebody that he can trust to take on the policies of his administration, that they're not going to gut him, someone that I can trust to continue my work in the office once I leave. And he sees Taft as the perfect pick. Taft is much more not negligent, but he's much more not so sure. Taft does not want to be president. He's not the greatest public speaker. He's not the greatest in front of large crowds. He knows this, and he argues that to Roosevelt. He's like, I'm not a major politician here. I'm not a major public speaker. I would much rather be a judge on the Supreme Court than I would be president. And Roosevelt kind of pressures him enough that Taft gives in. He's like, you are my friend. Sure, I'll do it. I'll handle your policies and take on after you if I'm elected. So Roosevelt kind of pressures Taft into running for president in 1908 and securing the Republican nomination for president that year. And at the other time, as he has Roosevelt speaking into his head about running for president, Helen is also encouraging her husband to run for the Oval Office, even though Taft himself is a little bit weary of running for it. Taft ends up running. He gets the Republican nomination in 1908, and he defeats Democrat William Jennings Bryan, who had now been running for like 3 times and been defeated, and pledged to continue Roosevelt's progressive reforms once he got in office. The 1908 election was as follows. There were 483 electoral votes total. You needed 242 of those to hold a majority and be elected president. Taft took 321 electoral votes compared to Bryan's 162 and won 51.6% of the popular vote compared to Bryan's 43.1%. Well, I think I have that map here while we're discussing the election. Just a few more while we're at it. So here we have a picture of Taft during his time in the Philippines with one of the native Filipino leaders at the time when he was serving as civilian governor at the time in the Philippines. This is probably about 1903, 1902. And here we have an image of it's a political cartoon from back in the day on the cover page of Puck magazine from about, I believe, 1907, 1906, maybe, when no, this one would actually be right when Roosevelt leaves office. I'm thinking of the wrong one. But this would be 1908, and Roosevelt's leaving office. Someone's carrying his big stick diplomacy. He's leaving office, and Taft's the new person in the White House, and Roosevelt is pretty much handing off his policies and entrusting them to Taft, thinking that Taft's going to be the perfect person to take after this. He's going to be the perfect person to protect my legacy and protect my work and continue it, even though I'm no longer president. That would end up flipping within 4 years. And then here we have a picture of the Electoral College map from the 1908 election that Taft won. Taft took all the states in the red, obviously, but as usual, lost the mostly Democratic stronghold of the American South and a few states out west. And then here we have a picture from Taft's inauguration on March 4th of 1909 in Washington, D.C., where Taft and Nellie are both riding in this carriage right here. You can kind of make them out. So Taft would take office, as we just mentioned. His inauguration was March 4th of 1909, so as of that, he is officially now president. And at weighing over 350 pounds, he is also the heaviest president in American history, which has led to that myth of him getting stuck in a bathtub. And while he did have a very large bathtub, it's very unlikely that he actually got stuck in it. The bathtub that was ordered for Taft, specifically during his time in the White House in 1909, it was ordered almost immediately, was one of the largest ever made for an individual person. And this is the picture of them installing it in the White House. When Taft was sitting in it, one man could fit in it. But when normal, it was big enough for 4 normal-sized men to fit in this thing. It was that big of a tub that Taft needed. So, yeah, we do have a record for Taft. He is the heaviest president in U.S. history at over 350 pounds. So, he was a heavy-set guy. Now, Taft would initially continue, as we mentioned, he would initially continue Roosevelt's policy of trust busting. So when he comes into office, he told Roosevelt, I'm going to continue the work that you're doing. I'm going to safeguard your policies and your programs that you set up. I'm not going to get rid of anything or to attack your legacy. And he continued this initially. He initiated over 80 antitrust suits, which was more than twice of that of what Roosevelt had done. So in a way, Taft is actually going more actively after these trusts than Roosevelt had even done right off the bat. However, he would later relent off his antitrust suits that he would file and align with the more conservative members of the Republican Party, which would start to anger Roosevelt and start to make Roosevelt wonder, okay, what are you doing? Why are you allying with the conservatives who are opposed to the progressives within the party who want to enact these laws that need to happen to change American society for the better, and these conservatives who are like absolutely opposed to any changes? Why are you siding with them all of a sudden if you're going to protect my legacy and you're going to continue my work? Because they're not going to help you. In 1909, Taft would call a special session of Congress in order to debate tariff reform. However, the proposed Payne-Aldrich Act would do little to lower tariffs, and it was widely opposed by Roosevelt and other progressive Republicans. And despite progressive Republicans and Roosevelt's expectations that Taft was going to, do what they needed him to do and say no, Taft signed the bill because he had allied with the conservative faction. He kept these tariffs at what they pretty much were and did not do what the progressives and Roosevelt thought he should do and thought he would do, given that he had promised that he would uphold Roosevelt's policies and legacy. And here he is with it not even a year in, and he's already starting to bomb things. Taft would also uphold the policies of Secretary of the Interior Richard Ballinger, and he would dismiss Ballinger's critic Gifford Pinchot, who was a conservationist and head of the Bureau of Forestry and a close friend of Roosevelt, which would anger Roosevelt a great deal. It's one of the few people that he has left from the Roosevelt administration, and Taft pretty much gets rid of Ballinger because he is criticizing the Secretary of the Interior, who wants to downsize the size of wildlife refuges. He wants to downsize the size of national parks in order to get to, natural resource production. Of course, Ballinger gets the critic from Pinchot, who is one of Roosevelt's conservationist appointees, and Pinchot gets fired because he's a critic, because Taft sides with Ballinger on the issue and does not believe in enlarging federal protections for wildlife reserves and everything else, which angers Roosevelt quite a deep deal. And it was Pinchot's firing that ended up kind of finalizing the split within the Republican Party and distanced Taft from Roosevelt. After this point, Roosevelt starts to realize that Taft is not doing what he said he was going to do 4 years earlier. Taft is merely going to bomb everything that I've done. He has sided with the conservative faction, and he's going to undo everything that I've tried to do in the last 8 so years of office. Taft, in foreign policy, would pursue something he would break from Roosevelt on another issue. Roosevelt was a very big believer that international disputes could only be solved through conflict, through war. Taft was not a believer in this. He was not an advocate of war. And where Roosevelt had what we call the big stick diplomacy, where, you know, speak softly but carry a big stick, kind of force your enemies to realize your power and your strength and force them to back down. Taft was not about that. Taft had something that we call dollar diplomacy while he was head of president and in head of foreign affairs. He believed that diplomacy's goal should be to further American commercial interests, and that the United States should use American economic power in order to attain global influence abroad. He argued that Taft said, quote, that this would substitute dollars for bullets, that the idea was, we can give financial aid to countries and this will prevent wars from breaking out because if we invest in countries and help them grow and help them gain infrastructure and technology and, modernize, they'll be less likely to have a conflict. Not really. One of the very first tests of this newfound dollar diplomacy that Taft ended up adopting was in China. And in China, Taft feared that Russian and Japanese ownership of the railroads in China, which they owned almost all the railroads in China. China owned very few of the railroads within its own border. But he feared that Russian and Japanese ownership of the railroads within China could end the open door policy of free trade with China that had been pursued since the McKinley administration and would end American trade in China, and thus the Americans would be shut out of the Chinese market, which was a big no-no for Taft. So what did Taft believe he could do? He believed, well, maybe I can use my dollar diplomacy and buy the railroads. So what Taft ended up doing was he offered to buy the railroads from Russia and Japan, and then he would return them to Chinese ownership after he had purchased them. However, Russia and Japan, upon hearing the fact that he was going to return them to China if he bought them, and the fact that their trade lines depended on those railroads in China, pretty much flat right out told Taft, we don't care what you're offering us. No, we're not selling them, which embarrassed Taft publicly. He would also encourage during his time in another area of major trying to invest in American dollars, would he encourage American investment in Latin American countries in order to help stabilize them and protect them from foreign influences in Europe. Mind you, in the past, several Latin American countries had been invaded by European armies in terms that they owed large debts to European loaners. And this was something that Taft wanted to correct. He said, "Well, how about we invest? We are the next door neighbor. We should be the ones investing and helping to stabilize them and helping get their act together." However, in many cases, this Latin American aid was much detested because Latin American countries did not like the fact the United States was pretty much trying to buy their economies and trying to, kind of control them through money, and this was not something that sat very well. Two Latin American countries in particular, Nicaragua, which was a botched affair at the time, ended up devolving into rebellion, and in the case of Mexico, dictator Porfirio Diaz was deposed in 1910 and ended up starting the Mexican Revolution, which would last for another 10 years. So both Nicaragua and Mexico, despite the fact that they were investing these American dollars, it did not work. In Mexico's case, it was a lot of foreign companies or higher class individuals who held the power, while a lot of low class Mexicans did not own a lot of the land or the political power, and this created a great dissension between them. So Taft's dollar diplomacy really doesn't work out that well. Latin American countries are still devolving into rebellion, and in China, it absolutely fails to convince Russia and Japan to sell their ownership of Chinese railroads. Among the few achievements that Taft did get at this point in his presidency was that he did manage to empower the ICC, or the Interstate Commerce Commission, in order to set railroad rates. Railroads had, since the end of the Civil War, largely been setting their own rates, and there had been what there had been called rate wars, where railroads were trying to outpace each other with how much rates they could charge or who could get the cheapest. And it was hurting people and businesses that shipped goods over the railroad because they never knew when the railroad rates were going to go up. So after 1900, there was a call for tighter federal control over the nation's railroads, and it is during Taft's administration that the ICC gets enough political power appointed to it that that it now has the influence over the railroads to set a set railroad rate for all American railroads within the country. He would also get some achievement with supporting amendments to the Constitution, mostly the 16th and the 17th Amendments, that would end up implementing federal income tax, which, I mean, you can argue how good that one was. obviously, because a lot of people hate income taxes, and the other one being the direct election of senators, because before this, senators were not elected by the people. They were put in office and appointed by the state governors, not by the people. After that amendment, like now, they are elected by the people just as much as the House of Representative members are. Now, Taft and Roosevelt's split would become the foil of Republicans in 1912, as we had mentioned in the previous video. The split between these two has now caused a rift within the party. Taft is not admitting to anything that he's done wrong, as he believed he has done what he thinks is right, while Roosevelt is accusing him of being a backstabber, you're a traitor, you're a liar, you told me all this that you were going to do, and you didn't do it, and now you're trying to undo everything that I've done. Now, Taft was dead set determined that he wanted to be renominated and run for re-election in 1912 when his term came to an end. And even if Roosevelt ran, he wanted to run. Now, one thing that did happen pretty early on that kind of was, I guess, very detrimental to Taft's campaign was Taft had a very good friend that had probably the only person left in his administration from the Roosevelt administration, one of the few links between the two that was left. And that was his good friend, military aide, Archibald Butt. Now, Archibald Butt had been planning to kind of be a large part of Taft's upcoming re-election campaign after he secured the Republican nomination. However, unfortunately for Taft, his dear friend decided to go on a vacation to Europe, and then when he booked passage home, he booked passage on none other than the RMS Titanic. And I think we know how that one ended up. And, of course, Archibald Butt did not make it that night. He ended up being among the 1,500 dead that died and went into the ice-cold water. And this is a picture of President Taft with his friend. So Taft is here, and then it is this figure right here. This was Butt. This was the aide that ended up passing on the Titanic, and Butt's death kind of put Taft in depression. Taft, of course, it was a dear friend to him, but at the same time, Butt was going to be a good part of his re-election strategy and kind of helping him with that. And Butt's death kind of put a major blow to Taft's re-election campaign before it even really got to take off. So, going into the 1912 election, the Republican Party does nominate Taft for presidency, mostly because the conservatives are in power, they don't like Roosevelt, so they're willing to back Taft. Taft has worked with them, and they like it. Roosevelt, instead of backing down after being snubbed from the nomination, runs on a third party, the Bull Moose Party, and runs against Taft and the Democratic candidate of Woodrow Wilson. And because of the split between Roosevelt and Taft, Republican voters are also split in 1912, which allows Wilson to win the election by a sweeping majority, although Roosevelt actually came in second. Taft was dead last in this race. Taft received only 2 states in the 1912 election. He received Utah and Vermont, and both of those states only had 4 electoral votes apiece. So Taft, in his re-election bid, only received 8 electoral votes in order to remain in office. He would leave office on March 4th of 1913. So Taft, after leaving office, he would take up a teaching position and return to Yale. He would take up a teaching position at Yale Law School and reside there for almost the next 10 years, or 8, I believe it was about 8 years. In 1921, he would achieve his absolute lifelong dream when a vacancy for Chief Justice came up on the Supreme Court, and President Harding, a Republican at the time who had just been inaugurated, chose Taft and nominated him to take the place on the Supreme Court as Chief Justice, the top judge on the court. And Taft was confirmed by the Senate and got his lifelong dream of becoming Chief Justice, the only person in American history to have held the top office on both the executive branch and the judicial branch, which is quite impressive. As Chief Justice, Taft would improve organization of efficiency of the court. He would secure passing the Judges Act of 1925, which would allow the court more options in picking cases to hear, which has definitely influenced which cases the Supreme Court decides to hear and which ones it decides are probably not worth the court's time. He would write over 250 decisions of the deciding decisions that were done during his time as Chief Justice. Most prominent was his decision that he wrote for the Myers versus United States case of 1926, which invalidated the Tenure of Office Acts, limiting the president's authority to remove federal officials. So it pretty much it said that any acts that are passed by Congress to try to inhibit the president's authority to remove a federal official, even one within his own cabinet, They are illegal and unconstitutional. And had this been in place roughly, 50, maybe 60 years before, Andrew Johnson would probably not have been impeached in 1868 for having violated one such act. And that probably would never have happened. So it's only about 50 or 60 years down the road that I think Johnson, in a way, Taft, while he's Chief Justice, ends up kind of vindicating another president for something that he had done. And that's why, in my opinion, Johnson was wrongly impeached, because Taft later, his court was the one that came up with this case that said, yeah, this is not constitutional for you to be putting a limit on the president in that power. They have all the power they want to remove a federal official within the executive department. And Taft's health would end up beginning to fail him in early 1930, and he would end up resigning as Chief Justice shortly before his death due to heart disease on March 8th of that year. So he ended up passing away on March 8th of 1930. So let me see here. Yep, this is the last picture we have of Taft, and this is him in 1925 on the Supreme Court with the other justices. The only person in the United States history who will be both president and chief justice, or even serve on the Supreme Court in general, after leaving office. And that is Taft right there in 1925, after he left office, and now he is Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So that wraps up for Taft. Taft, as I mentioned, I think he's more mid. I think he's right in the middle. I don't think he's a bad president. I think he gets a lot. The fact that he comes right after, the fact that he comes right after Roosevelt, I think, is what kind of puts him in Roosevelt's shadow. And the fact that he went and broke with Roosevelt, I think, doesn't help him much. But if you really look at what Taft did, of course, his dollar diplomacy is definitely questionable, probably one of the most questionable things that he had done. But if you look at him trying to, get more federal control over the railroads, which had for years kind of been out of control and not really had federal intervention to kind of set rates that were going to best protect consumers, he did initially go after the antitrust lawsuits and did continue them for some time. If you look at the stuff that he did largely, and then his later work as Chief Justice, I don't think that Taft really deserves to be put in that bottom tier. I think he's just above mid-level. Somewhere, if we had put between 1 being the best and 100 being the worst, we could probably put him in the 40s. 40s, maybe I'd say higher up 30s. But somewhere in there is where I would put him. So that wraps up for him. So for next week, as I mentioned, we'll be doing the Halloween video, so that will be next week. So if anyone has any comments or any questions or anything that they want to add to the comments section, feel free to put that in there, and I'll be more than happy to go through it when I get the chance. So until next, we will do the Halloween video next week. So hopefully everyone has a good weekend, good start to their week next week, and we'll see you all back here for when that video comes out.